The webinar will take the form of 30 minutes of conversation between our two guest speakers, and this will be followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. And so without taking any more time, I would like for you all to join us and to hear their conversation. You can post your questions in the Q&A section of this webinar. And after 30 minutes, we'll start pulling them out, but you can post your questions anytime. So Professor Bustamante and Dean Gerardo Gonzalez, welcome to our webinar series, and please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Farida, and thank you to the Office of Global and International Engagement for hosting this event as part of National Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm delighted to be here and to have a chance to have a discussion with our special guest, Dr. Michael Bustamante, about his book. It is, here you see a cover of it, and it's titled Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile. And Michael, as a Cuban exile myself, my parents really made the decision. I was just 9 years old when I came here, but we came here as Cuban refugees and exiles at the time. I just found the title of your book very provocative. Can you explain exactly, or at least to the extent that time allows, what it means and what it is about?
Sure. Well, first, let me thank you, Gerardo, for all of the work you've done to get me here to campus over these next couple of days. And thank you to Farida and everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Cuban Memory Wars sort of began with a pretty kind of baseline acknowledgement on my part. As someone who's of Cuban descent, my father left Cuba when he was a young boy. My grandparents really spent most of their adult lives there. I grew up aware in some sense that there were, at the very least, these kind of two very competing understandings of Cuban history, or what had happened in Cuban history to lead up to and then since the revolution in 1959. On the one hand, I knew that the government in Havana portrays the revolution as sort of the culmination of years of unfulfilled struggle for national sovereignty, equality, political justice, and greater independence from the United States. But I also knew that in the exile community of which my family was a part, there was a very much a kind of a counterposed narrative, which sees 1959 as a turning point, not for the good, but for the bad. And as someone in graduate school who had read widely in the fields of memory studies, read a lot about the history of memory politics in Latin America, that is how societies grapple with conflicted legacies in their pasts, it struck me that no one had really attempted in a kind of a fairly comprehensive way to write that history for Cubans. What is the story of Cubans' competing understandings of and arguments about their past since leading up to the revolution and since, right? So this is the Cuban Memory Wars, and the title really refers to that, refers to the different ways that Cubans have tried to come to terms with, argue about, fight over, rethink their history, the legacies of their history in the context of different presents that they're living. And so it's a story, as the title suggests, that moves between the island, between the stage of revolution, as it were, and also the stage of exile, and also argues that these sort of competing narratives are more complicated than that sort of polarized two versions of the story that I started with, and that they're also evolving in dialogue with one another.
Sure, you make a very interesting point, I thought, that even though those memories, as you referred to them, were developed intentionally by virtue of the polemics that were utilized to create a storyline, whether you were in Cuba and creating a storyline on behalf of the revolution, or whether you were part of the exile community and creating a storyline here. But you say that even though those sort of move in different tracks and opposite directions, they really intersect throughout, and that in reality, those narratives interact in such a way they actually create history. Yeah. And I think that's fascinating, because we think of history as something that happened in the past, and you're discussing it as a dynamic process that in many ways shaped at these two major points of view interacting in ways that ultimately shape the actual ongoing real-time history of the Cuban American and Cuban community, and now even the Cuban diaspora.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I often turn back to a seminal text by the writer Michel Rouftriot, who has a wonderful book called Silencing the Past, which is sort of about the politics of history and memory and power in a broad sense. But one of the points that he makes is that, yes, history is about things that happened in the past, but history only exists in relation to the present, right? History is a positionality. We are looking back from the present, and therefore history really only matters in a sense for the way that it impacts the present. At least that's one of the arguments that he makes. And I think that's certainly true in the Cuban case, right? One has to understand that, on the one hand, the Cuban Revolution, when it comes to power, there's a short-term kind of set of histories and legacies that it's responding to. A guy by the name of Fulgencio Batista had taken power in Cuba by a coup d'etat in 1952. And so in the most immediate sense, those who were fighting to dethrone Batista and bring about something that they called a revolution were responding to that. But they were also responding to deeper legacies, kind of a sense that Cuba's history had kind of gone through these repeated cycles of rising hopes followed by disappointment, going back to the movements for independence, going back to the early years of the Cuban Republic. There was a sense of kind of the Cuban history as being unfinished business in all kinds of ways. And that sort of sentiment really galvanizes those who are fighting against Batista as much as the sort of short-term goal of just throwing out Batista. Batista is sort of a symptom of these broader issues. And so when they come to power, as the historian Luis Perez has argued, Cuban revolutionaries sort of appropriate history in a way. They position themselves as the culmination of all of these struggles, right? They're both the culmination, but they're also, Fidel Castro himself is saying, this time the revolution is for real. It's one of the first things that he says after the winning victory in 1959, as if to say, we're the culmination, but we're also going to leave behind these legacies of the past, right? And then as the years go on, Cuban citizens parse to what extent that promise is fulfilled, right? And then I think on the opposite side, Cuban exiles are coming to terms with a historical process that, in reality, many of them believed in at first. I think the sort of hidden secret of the history of the Cuban exile community is that many, many members of that early exile community were initial supporters of the revolution. They simply had a different conception of what the historical roots of that revolution were and what its historical aim should be. And when the revolution begins to radicalize towards socialism between 1960 and 61, many conclude that this is not what they bargained for. They begin to paint that history that they're living as a form of betrayal, and begin from the diaspora, from their own exile experience, to try to come to terms with what's happening. And so the interactivity between these two processes, I think, is born of the fact, on the one hand, that many of yesterday's revolutionaries became the exiles of tomorrow. And so they're intimately aware of the kind of deep stakes that are invested in the revolution's sort of own story of self. And I think the other interactivity comes from the ways in which, despite the divides of the Cold War, despite the so-called sugar curtain dividing Miami from Havana in the 1960s, 70s, and beyond, Cuban exiles are intimately aware of the way that the Cuban revolutionary state positions itself as the culmination of all that history, right? And they are responding to that in a way by saying, no, we have a different version of the history to tell, and you are perhaps hiding certain elements of the history that you are inconvenient. And revolutionaries on the island are conscious of the narratives that are being developed outside the island to oppose the revolution and are responding in turn. So there's really a kind of a dialogue that happens implicitly, if not explicitly.
Yeah, and I think in some ways that, to me, is part of this dynamic relationship that you describe. I mean, for the observer, from the outside looking at these two fundamental and major narratives, they seem to be monolithic in the sense that they appear that everyone who's a Cuban exile, and oftentimes we say the Cubans in Miami, because that's where the concentration is. Of course, they're in New Jersey, they're in New York, they're all over the United States and other places. But it seems like the idea of paradise lost, which is how you describe it in parts of your book, that somehow everything was great in Cuba before the revolution. And since the revolution, look what has happened is really a tragedy. That's not uniformly shared. I mean, there are different factions of the Cuban American community who have their own views about that history, that narrative, and in effect, there's another interaction that happens within that dialogue, and the same thing on the Cuban side. You have the narrative of the culmination of a dream deferred, where Cubans have been fighting for independence since it was created as a republic in 1902, but in fact, it was a revolution that made it a dream realized, and that the revolution is an ongoing realization and affirmation of that dream. But then you point to what happened with the Mariel boatlet, for example. For those in the audience who don't know, Mariel was that time that a group of Cubans went into one of the embassies. I think it was the embassy of Peru. Is that right?
Correct.
In Peru. And then Fidel kind of opened up the port of Mariel for anybody who wanted to leave. And there were 125,000 Cubans who ultimately left via the port of Mariel in boats that the Cuban American, mostly, but others may have gone there to pick them up and come back. And up to that point, if I understood your reference to that in the book, the Cubans in the island felt that everybody shared their dream or their idea of an affirmation of independence, when in fact it surprised everybody, people in the islands as well as people in the States or elsewhere, that so many Cubans would want to leave at once. What was the impact of that? And even to this day, how does that relate to the ongoing legacy of those memory wars?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So let me start with I think where you began, which is sort of the Exile community as not a place where there's simply one sort of counter narrative to the dominant narrative of the revolutionary state. I think if you go to Miami today, sort of everywhere that kind of Cuba is represented or its past is sort of represented in, albeit superficial ways, you do encounter a lot of these sort of representations of a kind of a Cuba as paradise lost, right? One of the most popular restaurants in Miami right now, and I highly recommend it. It's a great experience, but it's very much a step through time, go back to the Cuban 1950s when supposedly everything was grand, right before the fall. The reality, though, is that if you look at the Cuban exile community and its political cultures, plural, in the 1960s, that kind of sense of a uniform shared nostalgia has not quite cohered yet. And it hasn't cohered because in the exile community early on, you have a joining of different sort of segments and political sectors of the Cuban population that had very different relationships to the period of time and the political process they had just left behind. On the one hand, some of the first to leave Cuba after the revolution comes to power are those who had been affiliated with the prior government, right? Stands to reason. Those who had sort of the most to lose in terms of economic interests and things like that, vis-a-vis some of the revolutionary government's early reforms. But by 1960-61, you're getting more of a kind of a professional and middle-class element, but including many people who had not just identified with, but in fact contributed in many ways to the bringing about of this thing called a revolution. They were simply those, as I argued before, that had a different sense of sort of how radical it should be or how far it should go. And so in the exile community, you have very intense early debates about, what has just happened? What has just happened to us, right? And whose fault is it? So on the one hand, you have Cuban exiles who are looking at the people who had been pro-Batista in their midst and saying, this is all your fault. Right. This wouldn't have happened if your guy hadn't staged a coup in 1952. And then the pro-Batista people are looking at these other folks and saying, no, this is all your fault. This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't believed in the false promises of a Messiah who we told you was going to be a communist, and you said he wasn't because he said he wasn't, right? But turned out that we were right. And so this kind of battle over historical responsibility among exiles themselves is actually quite a prominent feature of the early Cuban exile community. And if I could show, I have a couple of images queued up that I think highlight this well. Hold hopefully everyone can see this, but you really have kind of two competing narratives. So this is admittedly, this is a magazine cover from the Cuban exile community in 1971. So, a decade or so after the revolution comes to power, that very much portrays this kind of nostalgic vision, right? It says, step into the Cuba of yesterday, right? As if that Cuba of yesterday was unproblematic. However, if you, rewind a few years, in the very same publication, you find this political cartoon that has a very different message and a very different reading of the recent history that's just transpired. This is a cartoon that suggests on the left, it's the 26th of July, 1959, so 7 months into the revolution in power, and things still look pretty good, right? This is a revolution in this cartoonist depiction that is nationalist in orientation. You see the image of Cuban independence hero Jose Marti, long live free Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. But by the image on the right, which is dated 1964, which is the date of this cartoon's publication, that initially hopeful revolution has become something that nobody wanted, right? It's been betrayed or taken over by communism in this view. But this is a very different point of view than the revolution, the sort of paradise lost idea, right? Because if you believe that some kind of revolution was necessary and was good early on, but then went off the rails, that suggests that what came before that revolution was not all perfect. Right. And so that kind of that competing idea of a revolution that may have been necessary in one way or another, but was betrayed or sort of went wrong, versus a sort of more simplistic nostalgia. Those are two competing impulses in exile political culture for quite a long time. And then with respect to the island and fast forwarding to events like Mariel, I mean, I would complicate the story a little bit. I mean, I think similarly, the story of Cubans on the island wrestling with and reckoning with their history is not an uncomplicated one. And it doesn't take, Cubans don't have to wait until 1980 to begin to wrestle with some of that complexity. During the 1960s, it's true that the Cuban government, and keep in mind, the Cuban government by 1960-61 is directing all media, all movie theaters, right? The mass media becomes a key outlet by which the state is sort of constructing a more and more unitary narrative of where the revolution came and where it's going. But in the process, sort of covering over some of the early debates and political divides within the revolutionary fabric itself over precisely the legacies of what different factions had done to bring about that revolution in the first place, right? And as the 60s go on, there are certainly lots of people who really fully invest in the promise of this idea of a revolution as a dream deferred, and that is fulfilling its promises. But there are many others, and you see it sort of pop up even in state-run or sort of state-administered culture, right? Like things like film, these sort of moments of creeping doubts, a sense by the mid to late 1960s that this notion that a new utopia was around the corner, clearly things have become quite difficult. The 60s is marked by considerable scarcity. It's marked by the effects of very strict sanctions from the US government, right? Life in Cuba in the 1960s is not necessarily easy for everybody, even if many believe in a common political project. And so by the late 60s, even the mid 60s, you see evidence of people kind of questioning, right? And that kind of questioning comes up, are we really fulfilling is this really the dream deferred, or are we sort of repeating a cycle of disappointment again? And so 1980, Mariel is one moment where certainly that questioning of the sort of received history is very potent, right? But it's not the only moment. There are other moments in the 60s and 70s that one could point to.
Sure. And I mean, you focus on the study of the first 2 decades after the revolution, from 1959 to basically 1979 and Mariel 1980. And I hadn't really thought about this, but there was another monumental event that happened at the end of that period that now I wonder whether in some ways it's linked to the Mariel exodus. And that is, it was in 1979 for the first time that Cubans who had left were allowed to return to the island, right? And many came back with different lifestyles. Some had resources that relatives in Cuba did not have. Many of them began to send money by way of remittance to relatives they had lost contact with. And I'm just wondering, and you don't talk about this in the book, and you don't make the connection, but as I read it, and I'm now hearing you talk about it, do you think those two events are related? I mean, could it be that as a result of hundreds of thousands of Cubans going back for the first time, interacting with others, giving others a sense of how the lifestyle had changed, had some kind of impact or impetus to create the conditions that then led to Mariel.
It's funny you asked this, because I do talk about this in the book. It's sort of the center of the last chapter, chapter 6, which is really centers on that moment of 1979, this moment of the first time that in mass, those who had left the island before that point were allowed to go back. It's an absolutely crucial juncture, and it's not only crucial because of the reunification of families and also what it meant in a context of a Carter administration that is in the process of trying to, if not normalize, sort of soften the U.S. approach toward Cuba. Right, it happens in that context that these trips are even allowed to happen. But it's also crucial as a moment of memory encounter. I mean, imagine, you're hypothetically someone who hasn't seen a relative or a cousin or an aunt or an uncle who left for Miami in the 1960s is coming back 10, 15 years later, and they're coming back to a country that they may not recognize. They're also coming back not just with stuff or sort of the accoutrement of their life in exile, which I think matters, but they're coming back with a very different sense of the story, not only of what the revolution was and why they left, but a story of what the expatriation has meant, right? Because of course, inside Cuba, it is somewhat taboo in the 1960s and 70s to really talk at length about those that leave, right? They become kind of silent presences everywhere one looks. But if there was discussion of the sort of the departed in Cuban official culture in the 60s and 70s, it was, these are the folks who were the traitors of the revolution. They were the sort of class and ideological enemies of what we were about. And so having contact with them at all was, if not verboten, sort of highly looked down upon. And so suddenly the government is opening its doors to the very people that they said were the traitors. And so for Cuban citizens, it's also a moment of, wait a second, the government has told us that the history of these people is such, and now they're saying, no, they can come back. And so that led to the sort of joking expression at the time that the worms, los gusanos, as the exiles were often referred to in a derogatory way in the 1960s and 70s, had become butterflies, right? That they were now allowed back. I think, in terms of a relationship to Mariel, those trips are fundamental, and it's a moment of memory encounter, as I call it. Chapter 6 of the book, I did a lot of interviews with folks who had either gone to Cuba in that time or had received like sort of long lost family members and what that meant to them, but also how it kind of shuffled the deck of how they thought about their world and the history that they had lived. But I think there's sometimes, in terms of the relationship with Mariel, there's a tendency to sort of simplify the equation, just to say, all these exiles they came loaded down with stuff. They did, right? They brought clothes, appliances, canned foods, right? In part because they knew that there was a need, because scarcity was still a real thing in Cuba. But there was also sometimes an implicit, a desire to show that your decision to leave had paid off and that you had sort of a success as an immigrant in a way that countered the very government's portrayal of what you were about. But the connection is often said, well, people sort of that the bringing the arrival of these exiles with all this stuff kind of lowers the veil, and it convinces people that the government is sort of full of it, and that's directly what leads to this exodus in 1980. I think there's a relationship. There are contemporaneous accounts of the time of Mariel migrants who say, my opinion of my situation changed, and I started to get the idea to leave when I saw that aunt come back, and the story of her life was not a story of suffering in the way that the government had told me it was. But I think it's more complicated than that. And as somebody once said to me, a journalist who was covering this at the time said, what might have been as disruptive was less the stuff that exiles brought, but the fact that they were allowed to come in and then leave. Because for Cubans, travel abroad in this period was basically impossible, except for in very special circumstances. And so there was a kind of a freedom of movement in the very fact of these exile trips that really sort of disrupted people's sense of who were disrupted people's sense of equality, right? The revolution was meant to create an equal society, and suddenly there are folks who are returning who have this tremendous privilege, which is to come and go, and they can't. So I think that, as much as anything else, is a triggering thing for the Mariel boat lift.
Yeah, You know, my family and I were part of that group that were called Gusanos. In fact, in my memoir that I recently wrote, IU Press published, I talked about those early days of the revolution and what it was like. And it wasn't just Gusanos. That's what resonate. I mean, that's term stayed with me. But there were a lot of commentary about being everybody who left was just welcome to leave because the island was the revolution was getting rid of traitors, Gusanos, all these derogative terms. But we don't have a lot of time left before we open it up to questions for the audience. So I'm going to fast forward to chapter 6, but I think it's very interesting. I mean, you focus your research in the first 2 decades, but then you really bring your findings to what's happening in Cuba now and in U.S. relations contemporarily, because you talk about the opening up of relationships, the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Obama under the Obama administration, then Trump's reversal, and yet the stories continue. And you know, when I think back about the Cuban history, it's one of making some progress and then retrenchment. You advance a little and then come back. And it seems to me that there was a new idea that the reopening was going to lead to some significant change, betterment of life in both ends. And now here we are with increasing hostility between the two countries. And the image in my mind is that one of Sisyphus pushing up a rock up the hill and then watching it roll back again. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts before we open it up to questions from the audience on the implications of your findings and what you describe so eloquently in those first chapters to what you then discuss in chapter 6 and where we are today.
Yeah, I'll try to cover that briefly because I know we're short on time. But suffice it to say, I when I set out to write this book and do the research, it began as a dissertation. I thought, well, I'm going to write the whole history of the Cuban Memory Wars, at least since 1959, right? These sort of battles over the past. I'm going to come, through the 1990s up to the present. I was quickly disabused of that notion, right? A dissertation needs to get done. I needed to sort of put a bookend around kind of the heart of the book, or the study, as it were. In 1979, this moment I've described seemed like a good one because it was sort of a full circle moment when exiles and people on the island were kind of coming back together and dealing with that in the ways that I just described. But I knew that the story doesn't end there. The Cuban Memory Wars are alive and well. They're as sort of furious as ever, especially in the last few years. And so what I tried to do in the conclusion of the book is sort of, give a very kind of expedited treatment of what's been the history of the Cuban Memory Wars since 1979, understanding that in one book, I can't possibly cover all facets of this very vast topic. In thinking about the Obama period, what strikes me, because I think one of the things in this book is also, it's really important. This is a very Cuban story. This is not a story of U.S.-Cuban relations per se, but all of that is happening in the background, right? And when Obama changed policy, it's interesting. Some of the way that he described his goals, angered people on both sides. It angered exiles and it angered revolutionaries, because what did he say? He goes to Havana in 2016 and says, I've come to bury the past. And there's a lot of unresolved issues, trauma, injustices on all sides of this equation in that very past, that for Cubans, it is not so easy to just say, let's wipe it away and move forward. So it's very interesting in that moment how a certain element of the Cuban government responded negatively to that very premise, as did exiles who felt that, again, there was not a monolithic opinion, but some exiles certainly felt that this push toward normalization was sort of pushing their stories to the side, as it were, right? What I would just say briefly in closing is that, since that, Obama might have attempted to bury the hatchet of the past between Cubans and between Cubans and the United States, but we've gone the exact opposite way. And for reasons that I can perhaps get into in the Q&A, we're in one of the darkest periods of the Cuban Memory Wars that I would say in my lifetime. That polarization is very, very strong. And it's overlaid onto a relationship between the US and Cuba that's at a very conflictual point. So the Cuban Memory Wars are not over by any means. Exiles continue to demand recognition for their stories from the Cuban state. The Cuban state continues to demand recognition of exiles' involvement in certain things in the 1960s, like armed armed opposition to the Castro government, violence. It's a mess, and to figure out how we get to a point of reconciliation is frankly very difficult at this juncture.
Well, amazing stories. I mean, you could listen to this forever. It's incredibly informative and challenges all the things that we've been listening back and forth. And here is the time for us to look at questions from the audience. And so I'm going to read the questions to you, and you can kind of respond to it back and forth. The audience members, you can continue to post your questions as we have this conversation. So the first question is, what parallels, if any, do you see between the present experiences of Cuban and Jewish children of immigrants and the memories of their parents and grandparents with regards to the Cuban Revolution and the Holocaust?
Interesting question, also a loaded one. I'm always hesitant to make any explicit comparison of the Cuban or any other experience with the Holocaust, for obvious reasons. It is true that in sort of the life of the exile community, you can find examples of exiles sort of invoking that historical parallel to somehow be an approximation of what they're going through. I find that when that invocation is made, I think it's a stretch, to put it kindly, and it's offensive, to be more blunt about it, right? Because I just don't think there's a comparison. But where I do think there are parallels in sort of the histories and this is not just unique to the history of global Jewry or Cubans, but any culture or community that has suffered traumatic ruptures in their history, is the way that those traumas get passed down from generation to generation. And even those children who haven't didn't experience those things directly, right? There are things that memories are passed down, and traumas are inherited. There's been a lot of literature on this, and so I think certainly in the Cuban exile and diaspora experience, you can find evidence of that, right? In terms of that passed down trauma and the needing to process it, and the need to sort of process the stories that one hears with hopefully the work of actually reading deeply and about the actual history itself, right? That's an individual thing that a lot of Cubans I know grapple with, that my father dealt with, that I in a certain sense had to deal with, and so perhaps there's a parallel there.
One thing this would be I'll try to keep it very short, but one thing that sort of made me think about is the whole issue of family separation. I think obviously the Holocaust experience was very different from the Cuban migration experience, but the Cuban migration, I think particularly the early migration, but really maybe across the board, and maybe the migration writ large from especially from Latin America, has been driven by the desire of the parents to give their children a better life. And I see these images of the Holocaust, of parents being separated from their children and the children being sent to gas chambers. That's a very extreme example, but nevertheless, the pain of separation is one that I think characterizes both experiences, one much more dramatically than the other, but they're both very much intensely felt, I think.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that the comparison also brings to mind sort of the comparative history of U.S. immigration policy. I mean, infamous are the stories of those fleeing Europe in the context of the Second World War, and sort of the notorious hesitancy with which the United States in particular received some of those refugees, right? Cuba too, right? There's the famous story of the ship to St. Louis that is turned away from both Miami Beach and Havana and sent back, versus a context after 1959 when it's the height of the Cold War, and the United States adopts a very favorable immigration policy for Cubans who were fleeing the revolution, right? And we can debate that, but I think it dramatizes that. I mean, I just add one last thing, is that these two histories are not separate. As I just mentioned, the story of the St. Louis didn't arrive in Havana, but there were many Jews who fled Europe and ended up in Cuba, in the early part of the 20th century, the World War II era, and then sort of suffered a double exile when they left the island again, right? So there's a significant Cuban Jewish community that really, I think, has links to both of those histories in very obvious ways. So that would probably be best poised to answer this question.
Well, you continue to make us think and think some more. And there's another question actually also that came from Aaron Lemro. Lola Rodriguez de Tios, famous reference of Puerto Rico and Cuba as being two wings of the same bird, is still referenced today as a metaphor for inter-island solidarity. In what ways, if at all, does this sentiment color the Cuban Memory Wars?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a great one. It intersects with the Cuban Memory Wars in ways that I think challenge the premise of the saying. So, Cuba and Puerto Rico are these fascinating foils of national stories. Cuba is they are both fall under the U.S. domain in the context of the misnamed Spanish-American War, which really begins as the Cuban War for Independence. But Puerto Rico has a very different destiny compared to Cuba. Cuba is allowed to become independent, albeit with very severe conditions on that sovereignty, especially early in the 20th century. Puerto Rico becomes effectively a colony of the United States, and I would argue remains so largely to this day, notwithstanding sort of the free associated state status that it has. So there's a sense there's definitely connections that are made between sort of Cuban left thinkers, radicals, anti-imperialists across Cuban history, but certainly after the revolution, and ties that developed between the revolutionary government and its institutions and supporters of the Puerto Rican independence movement. So those that sense of solidarity exists, and a sense that Cuba, as kind of the almost elder brother in the Caribbean that has achieved this magnificent revolution, sort of has a duty on itself to sort of lend its support to those in Puerto Rico who are aspiring to something similar. But I think there are also conflicts, right? Puerto Rico is also a place where a lot of Cuban exiles go after the revolution. And there's a fascinating and very, at times even violent history of conflict between Cuban exile groups who are active in Puerto Rico, who are very suspicious of the Puerto Rican independence movement because of its ties to the revolutionary government, right? And so that history of conflict, I think, is also part of the story. And they are at war with one another, not only over memory, but quite directly over politics in Puerto Rico itself, in a way that, again, challenges that premise of Cuba and Puerto Rico being two wings of the same bird.
Hmm. How interesting. There's another question too that came in that's going to push you also in a different way, perhaps in a similar way as well. Professor Bustamante, what do you think from ANCA, what do you think is the importance of archives, such as the Cuban Heritage Collection, in intervening in, or perhaps even in setting the Cuban Memory Wars as you described them?
It's a great question. Thank you, Anka. So I work in part at an institution at the University of Miami called the Cuban Heritage Collection, which is a department in our library system that's the largest archival collection dedicated to Cuba outside of Cuba itself. We have the largest collection on the Cuban diaspora anywhere in the world. My approach to that archive is the same approach that I have to archives in Cuba, where I work with them, is that we tend to think of archives as sort of neutral, just repositories of information, and they're not, right? Archives are sort of a first filter, in a sense, in our memory and history wars, because what ends up in the archive and what does not, and what decisions are made to decide what is appropriate and what is not, really impact the kind of histories that we can even tell, and therefore the sort of memories that we can construct for one another. What I think is interesting about the CHC is both the way that there are facets of the Cuban Memory Wars that are kind of embedded into its very being. The collection was created by Cuban exiled women who were working at the University of Miami, who really had a sense that this history of their own diasporic experience and the Cuban experience, again, especially outside the islands, needed to be preserved, and no one was preserving it. But that extended into a broader mission to collect broadly, sort of in Cuban history and culture across all periods. But at times you would hear those founding archivists sort of reference their mission as, we are here to sort of preserve the true history of Cuba, as opposed to the false somewhere else, i.e. in Havana. I think as an institution, we've moved away from that kind of a framing of the work that we do. We try to be comprehensive in our collecting, acknowledging the limitations and the filters that may exist. But where I hope that we can be of service and of an example is in really trying to have an open door policy, in allowing folks of any kind of political persuasion or positionality they may have on the Cuba issue, the Cuban Memory Wars, to come in and use our materials, save for some rare restrictions that exist that have to do with protecting certain individuals' confidentiality and things like that. So I think the archives for me were fundamental for this book that I wrote, right? And I was able to use these archives in ways that I think are counterintuitive to the reasons that they were created. I don't think the estate of a Cuban exile leader like Jose Miro Cardona intended necessarily for his archive to be used in the way I use it in the book, which is to grapple with how his own narrative of history is evolving in time. And so I think the archives facilitate interventions in the Cuban Memory Wars too, insofar as they allow us to kind of recover facets of those battles over the past that we in exile have tended to, and we in the diaspora have tended to forget. Right. As I said at the start, you go to Miami and you can come away with a surface impression that everyone in Miami sort of thinks the same thing about what happened in Cuba, and that before was sort of the glory times. It's when you get into the archives that you realize that the story is much more messy. And so I think the archives can help us intervene in the memory wars in interesting ways. But we always have to think critically about the institution of the archive itself, sort of what conditions what ends up in that archive and what ends up outside of it.
Mm.
I just want to add a side comment. I have recently had the good fortune of visiting the collection, and it's just a beautiful facility, and not only a rich resource for researchers and just interested people in Cuban history and Cuban art and all sorts of art events or activities, but they're also an instructional facility. They host students who do internships, they do programs, and many of those are online and available. If you have an interest or have the opportunity to visit, I would highly recommend it.
Well,
I'll just
go ahead.
if I could just say one last thing about the archive and the need to sort of think critically. I mean, I think one of the broader facets of the Cuban Memory Wars is that, there are histories on the island that don't form part of the official narrative, right? And are very difficult to access in terms of archival, resources there. So some of the darker histories of things that happened inside Cuba in the 1960s and 70s. So I think an institution like the Cuban Heritage Collection does have a role to play in being a repository for a certain kind of counter-official histories or histories that don't fit elsewhere. But I think we also need to acknowledge that archival institutions in Cuba are stores of other stories and experiences of the revolution of Cuban history generally that are as important to keep in mind in the historical narratives we ultimately construct. Mm-hmm. So I think as a colleague was saying this morning, these disparate archival institutions and the disparate motivations that may be behind them, they have different pieces of a puzzle that's sort of strewn around. And I think the more that we can put those pieces of the puzzle together, that's how we can get a truly sort of comprehensive understanding of the Cuban experience.
I have a couple of questions, and then given the few minutes that we have, you can kind of continue responding to them in ways that you find appropriate. The first one that came on my cell phone is a doctoral student who's studying the immigrant experience from Asia into the United States. And she's thinking about, research that's almost similar to yours. And she says, what puzzles me is that you're treating history and memory interchangeably. And so in a sense, both memory is considered as flawed or at times flawed and biased. And, and the history side of it is attempting, as you mentioned in your book, to aspire to something that's a comprehensive truth. That's problematic on both sides. And so it's problematic when you're trying to write a dissertation. So how do you respond to that? So that's the first question.
It's a great question. I mean, I wrestled a lot with terminology here, and ultimately I landed on kind of a bit of I don't know what the right word is, an unselective approach. I do treat history and memory as somewhat interchangeable, but here's the reason, and this is where those lines from the introduction come in, because I think there are so many different writers have tried to distinguish, okay, what is history versus what is memory, or what is collective memory? Does collective memory exist? And so there are as many sort of different ways of defining the differences between those categories as there that I could pick from, which makes me conclude that the definitions themselves are not very fixed. And what I was more interested in is the relationship between them, right? I think to call this a book, The Cuban Memory Wars, it's not just a story of how individuals relate to their past, which is the most immediate meaning of the term memory. But whether you believe that something real exists that's called collective memory, for me, and here I really took a lot of cues from a historical sociologist named Jeffrey Olick, who's written a lot about actually memory politics in Germany after World War II. What's most important is the action, that the claims making, the claims that are made on the past, whether in the name of history, academic or not, whether in the name of memory, right, or collective or personal, and it's the interactivity between these claims that citizen and political and social actors are making on the past constantly that really is what matters. And so ultimately, for me, the distinction between history and memory matters less than the interactivity between these different realms, right? So you could, if we want to talk about history as sort of an academic only enterprise that aspires to being comprehensive, we also have to acknowledge that history has blind spots because of the archive, because of biases, right? History is imperfect. History is even academic history is a participant in the memory wars of a society often, right? If stuff gets more widely read. And just like memory and individual testimonies can be thought of as, well, they are the repository of truth, right? Because they're people's individual experiences. We all know that individual memory is fallible. I don't remember what I ate for breakfast last week, right? Let alone what happened 10 years ago necessarily. So the kind of history is the truth and memory is subjective, or memory is the truth and history is sort of conscripted into official history and indoctrination. These are, all of those things can happen. And what I try to do in the book, and what I think scholars of memory have to do, is to try to look at that interactivity. What's the claims making process that's being made on the past by different actors in sort of public discourse, and what impact does that have on the history that's unfolding in that very moment?
Fantastic. What this is one of the things that I think you might get a knock on your door from more students who are looking at this in particular. The other thing that you've done beautifully, and again, this is that came in a question just now, is that your use of terminology. And one cited a phrase that you used in your book: terminology are not innocent bystanders. And so some of the words that you've been using, that you sort of brought to the surface through this book, is the word triumph, the word revolution, Fidel Castro as a name, sugar curtain, tobacco, things like that. So can you talk about what you mean by terminology as not as innocent bystanders? It's such a provocative expression.
Yeah, language is not neutral, and so often in the Cuban space, at least, take the character, if you will, of Fidel Castro. How one refers to him is often a first sort of sign of what memory camp, broadly speaking, one might find oneself in, right? So for Cubans that admire Fidel Castro, admire the revolution, he's not Castro, he's Fidel, right? There's a certain kind of familiarity that's implicit in that form of address. For his opponents, he's not Fidel, right? He's Castro, or many other names that I can't mention here, right? So in sort of writing a book about memory wars, it was a challenge, because the editorial side says, well, you should pick one way of addressing him and be consistent, right? That's what a good copy editor wants. But I couldn't easily pick one or two of those terms and have it not seem perhaps like I was putting myself in one of those memory camps or way of relating to his legacy. So what I opted for was I'm going to use a little bit of everything here, and I sort of name that as is. But there are many other examples. I mean, it's very common in Cuba to refer to the triumph of the revolution of 1959. I think it's in some sense a kind of an innocent phrase that describes a reality, right? This revolutionary movement dethroned Fulgencio Batista, came to power, but the triumph is sort of invested in a sense that this is a longer triumph, that we're going to continue to triumph. And for those Cubans who did not feel ultimately or right away that the revolution was a triumph that met their expectations, they might not call it a triumph, or they may be much more reticent to call it a triumph. So, revolution, right? The Cuban government to this day refers to the revolution as something that's ongoing. Can a revolution be permanent? I mean, by the definition strictly of revolution is spinning, right? It's sort of and kind of constant change. But if you have a political system that has been more similar than dissimilar over the last several decades, to what extent are we really talking about a revolution, right? That's in motion. So those terms are very fraught, and they intersect in all kinds of ways with the memory wars. And so I had to acknowledge at the front end, and I'm not the first scholar of Cuban history to do this. We always sort of stumble over our terms and the political valences that they have, and what's the sort of most neutral way to address some of these things. And there's not a perfect solution there.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say that we have barely begun to scratch the surface of what Michael has discussed in his book. And I want to remind you, it's called Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile. Michael's going to be with us throughout the day. Michael, I want to thank you so much for being part of this celebration of National Hispanic Heritage Month, and to give so freely of your time. He'll be presenting a keynote address at 11 o'clock at the Chevry Auditorium at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global International Studies. Farid, I want to thank you as well for organizing this session, and to the audience for asking some really good questions, and what I hope has been an enjoyable discussion for everyone.
Thank you all.
We have a few more minutes, actually. We have about, and I sort of would like to conclude this webinar by inviting you both in terms of personal reflections, because we have so few opportunities to hear from people who've, gone through experience on a different spectrum, different timeframes, different sites. So if we could conclude the session by a few minutes of your reflections as who you are, the lenses that you use as someone, Gerardo, who would come over, with your parents, and Michael, who's the son of people who've left. What are some of your personal reflections on all of this?
I mean, I would say that I learned a great deal from reading the book, because these are experiences that I've had as a child, and my family often told stories about it, and I never really read it in the context of a historical study supported by data and anecdotes and artifacts, and so I found it very elucidating. I was struck by in your concluding remark, Michael. It felt like you were striking somewhat of a pessimistic note. I mean, we have gone, we have gone through these trials and tribulations for decades, looking for ways to reconcile differences and somehow make it possible for greater levels of communications and exchanges and interactions in a positive, productive way. And it seems that something always gets in the way. And I think the last line of your book is basic, that we as Cubans are going to be, at least for the moment, have to deal, or are going to have to deal with inconsolable memories. Yeah. And that's certainly something that I have felt over the years. I'm hopeful that we can continue to work on finding common ground and to help us reconcile those differences. But there are lots of very huge impediments to doing that, and it's hard. It's easy to get discouraged. But I personally want to continue to do what I can in some very small way to bring people together, to learn about these different narratives and the implications they have for how we individually and as members of various groups look at the world. So I think it's just a terrific story, and I'm very glad that you have shared that with us, Michael.
Thanks, Gerardo. Yeah, the book ends on kind of a downer, not going to lie. It was sort of reflecting my feelings at the time that I wrote that conclusion, of a kind of repolarization, sort of re-energizing the Cuban Memory Wars in a particularly sharp kind of way, because but there's a paradox here, and I think I also reflect on this in the conclusion, is that I think at the level of people, most people, at the level of la gente, right, there's a greater willingness and a greater acknowledgement than ever among Cubans of things that are shared. This is not the 1970s anymore, when so much of the citizenry in Cuba kind of feels, has been educated to believe sort of one way of thinking about the history, and exiles have been educated to think about it in another way. I think there's a much greater consciousness, especially on the island, of the light but also the dark, and the histories that remain sort of not told publicly. And so talk to Cubans in Cuba, and they're very conscious of they're very aware of sort of what's not represented in certain dominant narratives that they encounter every day. I think we have more work to do on the exile side in that regard. But I think there is hope. The hope is that at the level of people, and perhaps less political leadership, there is more common ground. There's a sharing of experience, a willingness to acknowledge that your experience might not have been mine, but we can still, find ways to get along. But there are also memories that are inconsolable insofar as they demand. They're the kind of traumatic memories that demand justice, right? And until that actually happens in a sort of a political sense, and this applies to both sides, not to establish an equivalence between either. But until that happens, there's a certain pessimism that I can't help but feel, about where the Cuban Memory Wars might be going.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. You've drawn us so deeply into these stories and the histories. We thank you both for being here. Thank you, Michael, for coming over to Bloomington, Indiana. Thank you, Gerardo, for bringing him over and for coming back. We'll see you soon. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.